And now for our final and most important segment, Doug Walker's competitive analysis of the Cessna 400 and the Cirrus SR22 G3 Turbo.
In March of this year, Star TV introduced its first comparative analysis of the SR22 versus the 350 and 400. In July of this year, Cirrus brought out its most recent model of the SR22, the G3.
This model incorporates a number of important changes, most notably the introduction of an optional new Garmin avionics suite, which Cirrus has named the Perspective.
Today's video will review the global differences between our planes and the Cirrus, highlight the system changes, and discuss the avionics package. On the surface, the SR22 and the Cessna 350 and 400 appear similar. They're both low-wing, fixed-gear, composite aircraft. Cabin sizes of each are comparable. The SR22 and the 350 use the same engine. The SR22 Turbo uses a post-production kit modification to turbo-normalize the SR22. In contrast, the 400 is a clean sheet of paper, certificated, turbocharged aircraft. It features a factory-designed and built engine solution which is turbocharged, capable of higher than sea level manifold pressures. In addition, the 350 and 400 are certified in utility category for all weight and balance configurations within their envelope. We will examine in detail this and other striking differences that separate the Cirrus aircraft from the low-wing Cessnas. First, let's take a look at some issues directly related to quality and safety.
Cirrus has been very effective marketing their parachute while avoiding explaining why it's required for their airframe, the limitations of use, and consequences of use. In the emergency procedures, Section 3 of the Cirrus POH, they state, the SR22 has not been tested or certified for spin recovery characteristics. They further state that the stall characteristics of the SR22 are such that it is possible for it to spin and that the pilot may not realize the aircraft has entered a spin. That the only demonstrated method of spin recovery is to deploy the parachute, that the parachute may not work at speeds in excess of 133 knots, that if deployed, the aircraft may descend at a rate of 1,700 feet a minute. Imagine the force of 3,400 pounds hitting the ground at 20 miles an hour. And finally, that the plane and the occupants may be dragged along the ground by the parachute after impact. In contrast, the 350 and 400 are spin tested. The 350 is certified spin resistant, and the 400, like all other Cessnas, is certified spin recoverable. In contrast to coming down to 1,700 feet a minute in whatever direction the wind blows, a 350 or 400 in a deep stall will typically descend at 900 feet a minute, about half the descent rate of the Cirrus, and continue to be fully flyable and maneuverable. And it does so in a vastly more robust airframe. It's also interesting to note that in paragraph 4.1 of the Cirrus Aircraft Order Term and Conditions, they state that a mandatory condition of sale is the Cirrus may install data recording devices in the airplane that Cirrus may use for any purpose. And if the owner attempts to access or disable these DRDs, it'll void the warranty. One might reasonably conjecture that this is for Cirrus use in potential lawsuits, but is not available to the owner in the event that the data is in his favor. Let's compare the airframes. Both use a fiberglass material with pre-preg epoxy, but Cirrus cures their fiberglass at just 180 degrees versus Cessna's 270 degrees. This higher temperature provides the Cessna models with a much more heat-resistant fiberglass that's also stronger. This built-in heat resistance provides the aircraft with a vastly greater heat tolerance to hot summer day ramp temperatures and allows the Cessna owner the flexibility to select from a variety of color choices, including dark colors and even black. In contrast, Cirrus has only recently been able to add to their color choice spectrum by using highly reflective specialized pigment paints in order to mitigate heat absorption by their more temperature-sensitive materials. These colors are only permitted in specific areas. The carbon fiber reinforced airframe used on the Cessnas is one reason that the FAA awarded the 350 and 400 the first utility category certification since 1968 on any general aviation aircraft. That's the highest non-aerobatic certification available. This means that our airframe is roughly 30% stronger than any Cirrus. In real-world terms, this means that the 350 and 400 can withstand 3,000 pounds more force on the airframe than the Cirrus. As a result of this incredibly strong construction, the FAA awarded the Cessna 350 and 400 a virtually unlimited airframe life of 25,200 hours versus only 12,000 hours for the SR22. This stronger airframe has advantages in day-to-day flight performance as well. The maneuvering speed for penetration of rough air or in encountering unexpected turbulence is dramatically higher. 158 knots for the 400 versus 133 knots for the SR22. The difference between real-world indicated airspeed and cruise and the maneuvering speed is much smaller in the Cessnas than the SR22. Encountering rough air, the Cessna has less to slow down and can do it faster. Generally speaking, simply deploying the speed brakes will slow the Cessna to maneuvering speed almost immediately. Speed brakes are a standard feature on the 350 and 400. In contrast, Cirrus does not offer speed brakes as even an option on any of their models. Reducing speed in their airframes requires throttle reduction, pitch changes, and time. Speaking of time, speed brakes allow Cessnas to stay at their cruise speed for a longer time since they also reduce the time needed to reach flap deployment speeds, which, by the way, are 8 to 11 knots higher than on the Cirrus. There are more advantages afforded by the Cessna speed brakes, which I'll explain later. The integral carbon fiber roll cage in the 350 and 400 provides greater protection for the cabin occupants than the fiberglass roll cage found in the Cirrus. Demonstrated direct crush force protection in the 350 and 400 is 10,000 pounds. This number is not known in the Cirrus, but it's most assuredly much lower, as the tensile strength of carbon fiber is nearly 500,000 pounds compared to only 110,000 pounds for fiberglass. The Cessna 350 and 400 have dual wing spars for greater strength and fuel cell protection. These wing spars consist of over 100 carbon fiber bonded layers. The Cirrus wing uses just a single spar in all their models. Only recently, Cirrus began building the Model G3, and this is their first aircraft to use any carbon fiber into the single spar of their wing. They use no carbon fiber elsewhere in their airplane. No doubt, the G3 wing changes represent big improvements over those in previous Cirrus models, but they still fall far short of the strength inherent in the Cessna wing. The wing on the 350 and 400 is 35 feet 9 inches long. The Cirrus wing is much longer at 38 feet 4 inches, making it a tighter fit in a standard 40-foot wide T-hanger and requiring a greater turning radius to maneuver on the ramp versus the 350 and the 400.
Both aircraft have dual alternators. With the introduction of the Perspective model, Cirrus finally has a nearly redundant second alternator. We say nearly in that if the M1 alternator fails, you lose landing lights, air conditioning, and fans, which are not supported by the M2 alternator. Cessna, by contrast, uses two completely independent 60-amp class alternators, either of which can individually carry the full electric load of the aircraft. In addition, the Cessnas have a cross-tie switch that allows either alternator to provide all the power needs. This cross-tie capability gives the electrical system access to both batteries as well. The Cirrus does not offer cross-tie capability. It also only has a single battery located on the firewall, with a backup battery located behind the parachute compartment.
As I described earlier, the speed brakes on the Cessna 350 and 400 models can allow a more rapid descent into the terminal area and can do so without the need to drastically reduce the engine's power setting. The SR22, by contrast, requires the power setting to be reduced so much during descents into a terminal area that the risk of shock cooling the engine is ever present, thus the risk of greater engine wear and more frequent engine overhauls. This is the recommended way of slowing the Cirrus down, using that large Hartzell paddle prop to provide drag to slow the aircraft. This ensures rapid cooling of the cylinders, which is detrimental to long life. It is not uncommon to see a Cirrus getting a top engine overhaul at 600 to 800 hours. This may become even more common on the turbo model as there is more time in service. The speed brakes are a tool which dramatically expands your flight envelope. As mentioned earlier, they can help you more quickly achieve maneuvering speed and flap deployment speed. I find them particularly helpful in managing the higher landing speeds I may need to use to maximize control in turbulence and in strong crosswind landings.
You ever wonder where all the heat goes on an aircraft that has a free cast-ring nose wheel for steering? On the Cirrus, it's trapped. It uses a composite gear leg that doesn't have any way to whip the heat away, and the wheel fairings themselves are unvented. So it's trapped. It just stays there. There's been a number of incidents involving brake failures on the Cirrus where the O-rings have melded to the point that now on the new G3 model, you've got an opening in the side of the wheel fairing that has a white disc that is heat sensitive. If you have used your brakes to the point that you've raised the temperature above 293 degrees, that white disc starts to turn gray. One of the things you have to do every time you pre-flight the airplane is look at that white disc and make sure it's not discolored. If it is discolored, you have to replace the O-rings on the brakes before you're allowed to fly the airplane. Cirrus has had so many incidents involving brake failures and brake fires, and sometimes burning up their airplanes due to brake fires, that they issued a service bulletin saying to the owners, use your brakes less. In contrast, on the Cessna 350 and 400, behind this beautiful aerodynamic gear latch strut is a tubular steel landing gear, which acts as a heat sink to wick heat away from the brake as it starts to heat up. In addition to that, you have a vent on the back of the wheel fairing, which gives you positive airflow over the brake, cooling the brake as you are rolling out. There's never been a brake fire involving one of our aircraft.
Inflatable door seals and weather stripping on the Cessna 350 and 400 dramatically reduce the amount of interior cabin noise in flight. These are not available on the Cirrus. The seals also help to seal the cabin to help maintain constant temperature. The entire exterior door skins on the 350 and 400 are carbon fiber for rigidity and safety.
You want to close the doors in our aircraft? What you've got is a Gurkha bar closure system that puts a steel rod 2.5 inches into a carbon fiber frame front and rear. Cannot come open in flight, and to close our door, closed and locked.
The closing mechanism for the Cirrus continues to plague owners with both the difficulty of closing and latching, as well as periodically opening in flight. The control surfaces are carbon fiber in the Cessnas instead of aluminum as used in the Cirrus. By weight, carbon fiber is 50% stronger than aluminum, giving the Cessnas a much more robust design. A lot of people don't know that the Cessna 350 and 400 use control rods to move the elevator and aileron instead of cables and pulleys that are used in the SR22. Thus, in the 350 and 400, control surface input is direct and instantaneous, resulting in a positive and immediate response. The airplane is responsive to a light touch. It's a real pleasure to fly. The Cirrus is lighter on the controls, but is far more difficult to trim and is less responsive.
Let's talk about some obvious stuff. When you're doing a walk-around of our airplane and doing a walk-around of a Cirrus, it is transparent to anybody that's looking at it, and it'll really resonate with people that are interested in quality, that the construction of the airplane, there's just two completely different worlds. If you look at the flap attachment points, for example, these are 3 attachment points of stamped aluminum that you look at this stuff, it's just very lightweight materials. On the ailerons, you have, again, they're spring-loaded ailerons. You have 2 attachment points on the ailerons. The materials used, aluminum on the flaps, on the aileron, on the rudder, on the elevator. If you look at these attachment points for our aileron compared to the Cirrus, 3 machined aluminum attachment points on our aileron, 4 machined aluminum attachment points on the flaps, and look at the mass of these materials compared to the materials used on the Cirrus. It's evident why we're a utility category airplane and they're a normal category airplane. Now we're going to take a look at issues of convenience, performance, and utility.
Payload. Fully equipped with all options, which includes active traffic, active terrain warning system, XM satellite weather, built-in oxygen, speed brakes, heated prop, Oregon Aero interior, 4 Bose headsets, and the list goes on. The payload for the 400 is still 1,025 pounds. On the Cirrus Perspective Turbo that we have used for this video comparison, the payload is 871 pounds. Talking about usable fuel, the 350 and 400 offer 102 gallons of usable fuel versus only 91 for the G3. At best economy, 204 knots in the 400, its range is nearly 1,300 nautical miles versus less than 950 for the SR22 Turbo at the same speed. With the introduction of the Perspective model, Cirrus has finally joined the ranks of the other major OEMs in offering a Garmin avionics suite. While there's been a great deal of publicity by Cirrus and a number of articles in the press, the practical differences between the G1000 and the Perspective are more imagined than real. In reality, Perspective is simply the name Cirrus uses for the G1000. The functional content of the systems are the same and are displayed at the same resolution. When Cessna has completed its independent testing and is satisfied with the accuracy and performance of synthetic vision, that software update will be available for all of its G1000 equipped aircraft. The presentation of the Cirrus is more about the number and placement of knobs and buttons than true functional differences. In the Cirrus, you only have one control for COM frequencies, and that's on the PFD, and one control for the nav frequencies on the MFD. In reversionary mode, the ability to change your COM frequencies is lost. Up-down trim is controlled by a wheel instead of buttons. You have the option of adding a yaw damper versus a standard electronic rudder hold in the 400. As most of you have seen in their new ad campaign, the blue level button is the latest parachute-like gimmick. This functionality already exists in the Cessna 350 and 400, but in a different form. The standard response of the GFC 700 autopilot is to engage roll mode when the autopilot button is pushed. Then, by pushing the altitude button, you achieve the effect of the Cirrus blue level button. One button on the Cirrus versus two on the Cessna. The G3 screens are 12 inches compared to our 10.5 and have dual ARs versus our single. But I can tell you that I've done multiple demos in the 400 with prospective customers who have flown the Perspective, and not one has commented on a difference. At the end of the day, it does not offer any real-world, day-to-day flying advantages over the G1000 we adopted 3 years ago, but does have the practical limitation of losing COM function in the event of a PFD failure, which is much more likely to occur than an AHRS failure. Let's talk about the side stick versus the side yoke. On the ground, the differences between the side stick and the side yoke is obvious, but my impressions in flight were that the Cessna side stick is much, much easier to fly, particularly on cross-country flights. The SR22, simply put, cannot be flown cross-country without the aid of electric trim. It's far more fatiguing to fly.
Your ailerons and your rudder both have springs that bring them back to center, so that anytime that you are turning, pushing, or pulling that side-mounted yoke, you have a counterforce that's trying to pull away from you what you're doing to fly the airplane. Elevator, self-centering spring-loaded. Rudder, self-centering spring-loaded. No aerodynamic trim on this. If you're going to have to trim the flight control pressures in the SR22, what you're doing is changing the tension on the springs. This is what passes for elevator trim on the SR22. Aileron trim tab, again, just a piece of thin aluminum. I didn't hand fly the airplane hardly, in 3.5 hours I probably didn't hand fly the airplane as much as 30 minutes. And it was a tiring 30 minutes. Bringing it into land, just trying to get accustomed to the appropriate amount of control pressure on a control that is always trying to recenter itself, spring-loaded, was unpleasant for me. In contrast, obviously here our controls are true control rods, push rods that go directly to the aileron and elevator, and if you put it somewhere, that's where it goes. True aerodynamic trim with dual actuator rods, electric trim for the ailerons and electric trim for the elevator, which we'll look at in a minute. Even the aileron hinge root is fair. If you look at elevator, one, it has a much longer cord line, so you have a much bigger elevator, so you have much more pitch authority to fly the airplane, a much bigger rudder with much more yaw authority to fly the airplane. You have dual electric actuator rods to control the trim on the elevator, and it is true aerodynamic elevator trim. If you look at the difference in the mass of our rudder trim tab versus the mass of the Cirrus, much more robust, much heavier materials. Another one of those simplicity concepts that Cirrus has adopted for their airplane that for me is a little bit maddening. They have a single power lever. That power level combines the throttle and the prop pitch. Some engineer at Cirrus has arbitrarily determined at a particular throttle manifold pressure, this is the prop pitch that you're going to get, and you're not going to be able to change it. It's not a FADEX system. They tell you it's a FADEX system. It's not a FADEX system. It's a manual override eliminating your ability to set the prop pitch to an optimum level for flight. Come over here, we've got the manifold pressure in their normalized engine up into the yellow, and the Cirrus pilot that's with me is trying to finesse it back to get it down in the green, but as he's finessing it back, it's automatically pulling back prop pitch because it's not properly adjusted, and so we're sacrificing power because we can't get the prop RPMs up to the appropriate level for the manifold pressure that we've got, and we have no control over that. You know, in the 400 and in the 350, you have a veneer throttle control and you have a veneer prop control, and you can finesse those to within 10 RPMs or within a tenth of an inch of manifold pressure, and you can set that at any combination that suits you for flight to get your best power, get your best economy, whatever it is, noise level. Can't do that in this airplane.
In flight, pilots and passengers will really appreciate the digital automated climate control in the Cessna. It is designed to maintain constant cabin temperature. When cooling, the 22,000 BTU unrestricted duty cycle air conditioner will cool the cabin 10 degrees per 5 minutes of operation with its 1,400 foot-a-minute blower. Heat is distributed through the floor ducts, while cold air is distributed through 12 cabin air outlets, providing ideal air distribution throughout the cabin. The Cessna air conditioning system may be used immediately after engine start and for all phases of flight. The Cirrus system is required to be turned off for takeoff and uses a 14,000 BTU system that, according to owners, will not cool a hot cabin on high ramp temperature days. Moreover, when AC is installed in the SR22 Turbo, Cirrus has to install ballast plates in the tail cone to compensate for the extreme forward CG. On opening the baggage doors on both aircraft, they seem to have comparable sized baggage areas. But as you can see, the cargo compartment of the Cessna extends much further back. It's big enough to hold golf clubs, nearly doubling the capacity of the SR22. Where the Cessna 350 and 400 have a hatch shelf, Cirrus has a parachute. As a point of luxury convenience, you can't beat the Cessna key fob. This allows you to remotely unlock the cabin doors and illuminate the interior cabin light and the exterior step light. Service. This is a priority for any aircraft owner, and you can't beat Cessna service. With over 260 service centers across the country, we have nearly 4 times as many domestic options as Cirrus does. Cessna fields 60 additional service centers worldwide compared to virtually none for the Cirrus.
But finally, with high-performance aircraft like the Cessna 350 and 400, speed's what's really expected. And simply put, the 350 and 400 are the fastest airplanes in the world in their class. As Chris Lee aptly noted in our first look at the SR22, they're sometimes faster than aircraft in higher classes, such as the King Air C90. Compared with the G3 at best power, top speed for the 400 is 235 knots versus the G3's 219 knots. Typical cruise speeds for the 400 are about 17 knots faster as well, 220 knots versus 203. It's also recommended not to operate the Cirrus rich of peak and cruise, so the 219 knots is really kind of a theoretical number as the engine develops too much power compared to what it was designed for as a normally aspirated engine. The Cirrus recommends flying lean of peak and cruise and uses this as a way to limit the power developed by the engine, hence an attempt to preserve the engine from failure. The percentage of power gauge displayed on this perspective is really only a percentage of the available lean of peak power, not the full rated power of the engine, and hence is misleading to the pilot. Climb speed. You know, in the 400, I'm climbing at over 1,000 feet a minute through 21,000 feet. I'm 19 minutes to 25,000 feet, 49 miles downrange. Takes me 32 minutes to get to 25,000 feet in this airplane. And once I level out and cruise, I'm going 20 knots faster in the 400 than I am in this airplane. At the end of the day, we have a vastly more sophisticated product. It's a more robust product, it's more safely designed, it's more comfortable to fly, it goes further, it goes faster, looks way better, and it's a Cessna. It's not a Cirrus. It's a better product. We hope you've enjoyed this look at the 350 and 400 today and selling against the SR22 Turbo Perspective. For Star TV, I'm Doug Walker.